Member from Huron-Bruce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to add my voice to the debate today. I first want to commend my seatmate and colleague, the member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock. She has done a phenomenal job. Her name is synonymous with heart, and she has travelled across Ontario for all the right reasons to increase awareness about this horrible crime. And I thank her. Not once has she tried to play a political game with her sincere efforts to raise awareness in order for us to stop this horrific crime that's happening to our children. And I commend her for not even stopping today. Earlier today, she introduced legislation to actually train judges on the whole affair of sexual assault. And I commend her for that too. Just don't ever stop. You're doing a marvelous job. But I'd like to add my voice to this debate based on two things. Last Monday, I attended a screening of a documentary called I Am Jane Doe. And within approximately 35 hours, I learned that a young person who is abducted will be trafficked for the first time, and that child will be raped upwards of 30 times a day. It was horrific what we learned in that particular documentary. And my colleague is absolutely right. This is not an urban issue. This is not a northern issue. This is not an American issue or a European issue. This is happening right here in our province of Ontario. It's happening in my riding. It's happening, I would suggest, in all 106 ridings that we have in Ontario, and we need to be aware, we need to educate people, and we need to stand together, united, to ensure that this stops. And that's how I was so inspired by the documentary, I Am Jane Doe. Another area that I would like to discuss today is something that's near and dear to me. And I've recently been appointed the PC Critic for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation Speaker. And my next remarks will reflect the focus of human trafficking on our Indigenous communities throughout Ontario as well. And it's stunning, the lack of data that we have on this particular issue. For instance, we don't know in Ontario how many Indigenous and First Nations women are trafficked annually in this province. We don't know, Speaker, how many of these women and girls, many of whom are children, are able to break free of their captors and reclaim their lives. Speaker, we don't know how many of them are from rural communities, northern communities, urban centres, south, east, or western Ontario. We don't know, Speaker, how many of these women continue to face physical and psychological trauma even after escaping. And sadly, this data is missing. As a province, as legislators in Ontario, we need to do better. A report from the Ontario Native Women's Association, they're known as ONWA, from February 2016, titled Sex Trafficking of Indigenous Women in Ontario, found that data on human trafficking in Ontario and Canada is generally severely lacking. Estimates of trafficking vary significantly, and questions have been raised about these numbers due to the availability, quality, and validity of the data. Provincial data is nearly non-existent. Having data on such a matter is important, not only to recognize the problem that we know exists, but also in taking steps to address it. Speaker, how do you allocate supports if you don't know where it's needed most? How do you know what supports to allocate if you don't know the needs of the survivors? This data is so important that when it came time to make recommendations to the report, the first one identified by ONWA was to, and I quote, conduct provincial-wide research initiatives that will result in annual statistics regarding the sexual exploitation of Indigenous women and girls in Ontario without delay. I ask the members opposite, what has caused the delay? Where is this information? It was also identified as a first strategic priority in the 2011 Aboriginal Sexual Violence Action Plan published by the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres, that this government even recognized that there was a lack of data collection, and we haven't seen much. They committed $750,000 over 3 years to improve it, but Speaker, when I picked up a copy of the Year 1 update, I was terribly disappointed. Tucked away on the third page, on one line, was this update on data collection, monitoring progress made under the strategy to ensure commitments are fulfilled. They're only monitoring. I can't even say it, I'm so frustrated right now. They're only monitoring progress. They're not collecting more data. They're not collecting relevant information to allow us to take steps to make life better for Indigenous women and girls in Ontario. This is frustrating beyond belief. We don't know what the key performance indicators or data collection mechanisms are that this government has established. And we still don't know, as I said, what data has even been collected. You know, in this report, there were a mere 11 words. There were only 11 words on what they've done thus far, and that was all geared towards claiming they're monitoring progress. That's shameful, in my mind, Speaker, and we must do better. And speaking of the strategy, my team, we went through all 39 pages of it. And do you know how many times human trafficking was actually mentioned in this particular report? 3 times. And 2 of those mentions said exactly the same thing. This government needs to pull up its socks, Speaker. I think the most disappointing thing from this government is that the fact is they've had 2 opportunities to support victims of human trafficking before now, when MPP, that great MPP from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, introduced Bill 158, and again with the introduction of Bill 17. But instead, they dragged their heels so they could introduce their own legislation instead. There's so much to do, Speaker. We have to get at it. I thank our colleague from the PC Party of Ontario for doing such an amazing job, and I ask all of our colleagues in all 106 ridings to join us. Let's talk about what's happening in Ontario. Let's admit that it's real. Let's talk about what supports are needed after we once reveal and understand the needs that are generated. What are the psychological supports needed? What are the physical supports needed? I am Jane Doe. We learned that young people are drugged as soon as they're abducted, and then they're trafficked, and they get moved from town to town to town. The doorknobs are taken off from the inside. So these young people, if they do happen to escape, they don't have a clue where they are. We need to think about the right supports. And to my Indigenous friends, I think about the amazing Indigenous and Métis young ladies who joined in Daughters of the Vote in Ottawa. And Trina, in particular, said, where are our non-Indigenous allies? To Trina and everyone else, I say, I am here. Thank you, Speaker.